Hi everyone. In this video I just want to talk about what's going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. Now remember, the aggregate demand curve is a story about total spending or aggregate expenditures in the economy. And it shows the relationship between the average price level and the total amount of spending, assuming everything else is held constant. Well, in this example, to show the shifts, I'm going to use the thought experiment where we say, hey, let's just assume the average price level P is fixed, so it's not changing, right? Then what's going to happen to the aggregate demand, or the total amount of spending that occurs, if something happens, assuming the average price level is held constant? So for example, let's just say, for the sake of argument, there's an increase in wealth, right? This could be an increase in housing prices, an increase in stock prices, or whatever. The important thing is that, on average, the country just suddenly becomes wealthier. Doesn't matter the reason right now. Let's say there's a boom in the stock market like there was in the late 1990s, or there's a surge in housing prices like there was in the early 2000s. Doesn't much matter. The important thing is that households become wealthier. But one thing we know that households do with some of the wealth is that they increase consumption expenditures, right? So there'll be an increase in consumption expenditures. Now, if we're willing to assume that everything else is held constant, then the increase in consumption expenditures will lead to an increase in real GDP, right? How much of an increase? I don't know. We haven't said anything about the magnitudes. The important thing is that the amount of GDP, or the total amount of spending, will be somewhere greater than the initial amount, so you'll be at Y2. Now remember, we said we assumed the price level was held constant. That means my new point is point B. Point B is not on the initial aggregate demand curve, so there must be some new aggregate demand curve, AD2, that looks like this. So an increase in wealth is going to cause an increase in consumption, which will shift AD to the right. Now, there's nothing special about consumption here. Anything that led to an increase in consumption, investment, government, or net exports while holding the price level constant will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So anything other than a change in the average price level itself, which leads to increased total spending, will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Right? So if it wasn't an increase in wealth, I could have said there's a stock market surge, and let's pretend that has no effect whatsoever on consumption expenditures. In fact, it doesn't have to be a surge in stock prices. Let's just say firms become really optimistic about the future, and as a result, they want to go ahead and invest more. So consumption, government, and net exports are constant, but there's an increase in investment expenditures. Well, in that case, we can just say there's an increase in optimism. So let's say increased optimism on the part of firms. So they want to go ahead and spend more by buying more capital goods. That's going to increase total spending and shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Or it could be there's an economic boom in Europe, so they buy more stuff from the United States, so U.S. net exports increase. So that causes an increase in the total amount of spending, so that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Or an increase in government expenditures would do the same thing. The important thing is anything which increases total spending, other than a change in the price level itself, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and anything which decreases total spending, such as decreased optimism on the part of firms, a recession in Europe, a cut in government expenditures, or a decrease in wealth, will end up resulting in lower aggregate spending, or lower aggregate expenditures. So the new level of GDP would be at Y3. The economy would be at a point like C, which is obviously not on the initial aggregate demand curve, so the entire aggregate demand curve in that scenario will have shifted to the left. So increase in total spending shifts aggregate demand curve to the right, decrease in total spending shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. And that's essentially it for the aggregate demand curve. It's a story about total spending. If the event I describe, or that you hear described, increases total spending, aggregate demand shifts to the right. And if the event you hear described decreases total spending, aggregate demand shifts to the left.